Okay, well that was a smooth start. Good evening everyone. My name's Rod Campbell and I'm an economist at the Australia Institute. I'm actually one of the newest members of the Institute, so I'm particularly excited to be here hosting my first Politics in the Pub. Is anyone else having a first here? Is this anyone's first Politics in the Pub? And you got a front row seat too. Gee, you've done all right. Now, well, it's a night of firsts. It's my first hosting of Politics in the Pub. It's Matt's first night as headline act of Politics in the Pub. It's the Australia Institute's newest recruit and administrative backbone, Faith's first time at Politics in the Pub. And the tradition is, Faith, if it's your first time as a staff member, you shout the entire audience. And most excitingly, it's the Australia Institute's first crack at cartooning and graphic interpretation of policy issues. I hope you've all found a copy of Ret Boy, the initial episode of his adventures. Which in 100 years' time could be worth something. In order for it to be worth something in 100 years' time, the planet still has to be here. And if that... we won't. Speak for yourself. I've been eating my vegetables. Which sort of leads us into the purpose of the evening. We're here to talk about renewable energy and climate policy. And which brings us to our main speaker, Matt Grudnoff, energy researcher at the Australia Institute and all-round marvellous guy. Surveys that Matt has been involved with show that Australians love renewable energy. Does anyone here love renewable energy? Yes. You are amongst the 86% of Australians who say they do too. However, the Abbott Government don't seem as persuaded as you all are, and are looking to review the Renewable Energy Target, a policy responsible for clean inroads into dirty energy use in this country. Linking renewable energy to price hikes even though it's not true. I'm unconsciously starting to talk like a superhero here. It could be Ret Boy's influence.
His sidekick.
Linking renewable energy prices to price hikes, even though it's not true, has been pretty effective so far. And after a review into the RET, may allow them to abolish or reduce it to the point where it's ineffective. Maybe I'll end my cartoon-like introduction to Matt because he is the genuine superhero of the day. He doesn't look much like Ret Boy, but it only takes a quick trip to a phone booth to fix that. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Matt, who knows vastly more about the Renewable Energy Target and climate policy in general than I do. And Matt will talk for about half an hour, and then we'll have some questions. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Rod. All right, as Rod said, tonight I want to talk about the Renewable Energy Target. I'm going to briefly talk about how it works, but I think most people have got at least a rough idea about how it works, so I won't dwell too much on that. But what I want to really focus on is the politics of the RET and why we have ended up with the RET review that we currently have. Now, sometimes it's easy to pigeonhole certain politicians and lobbyists and political players generally that are anti-renewable and just target them and say, oh, they're just against renewables without fully understanding why. But I want to explore a bit, particularly the fossil fuel generators and their lobbyists and why they've gone from supporting the RET to being their fiercest critics. So firstly, how the RET works. We'll just quickly go through this. Most people will know that it's 20% target by 2020. Well, it's not really that. It's actually a fixed amount. It's 45,000 gigawatt hours of electricity by 2020, and that'll become important later. It was split into what's called the large renewable energy target, which is big wind farms, big solar farms, that kind of stuff, sort of commercial scale stuff. which has 41,000 megawatt hours, and 4,000 into what's called the Small Renewable Energy Scheme, which is solar hot water, PV on the roof, that kind of things. Now, the way the Renewable Energy Target works is it's very similar actually to an emissions trading scheme, only it works in sort of reverse. And that is every time somebody produces a megawatt hour of electricity, they get what's called a renewable energy certificate, or a REC. And basically all that happens is that retailers, which are the people who sell you electricity, have to make up or buy a certain amount of RECs every year. And that basically just guarantees a certain amount of renewable energy will be created. So in 2020, if the REC isn't played with, there'll be 41 million RECs, because 41 million megawatt hours, which works out at 41,000 gigawatt hours. So there'll be 41 million RECs created, and effectively we'll have our 20%. Now, as Rod talked about, renewable energy is actually very, very popular in Australia. And this is also an important factor that's played out in the political discussions. In fact, the only thing more popular in Australia is probably puppies, kittens and public holidays that involve a lot of drinking and eating. 86% of people, so the Australia Institute did a survey which showed that 86% of people want more renewable energy in Australia. So it's not even 86% support renewable energy, it's that they think we need more renewable energy in Australia. 79% of people thought that the government should support an expansion of renewable energy. So people were behind the government being involved in expanding renewable energy. A staggering 90% wanted more electricity generated from solar. 80% wanted more generated from wind. And 68% wanted less electricity generated from coal. So it's not just that renewables are incredibly popular, it's also that coal power is incredibly unpopular. So firstly, in order to understand the politics of today, we need to look back a bit. It might surprise some people, but the RET was actually started by Howard in 2001. The mandatory renewable energy target, it was set at 2% by 2010. And it was very, very successful in that it achieved the target. In fact, it was so successful that Howard was at a meeting and he wanted to work out a way of diluting that RET because it was being too successful. So I think Howard kind of felt that environmental policies usually fail, and he was hoping that this one would fail. And the fact that it was succeeding was quite upsetting. The Australia Institute actually published some leaked notes from that meeting, which showed that Howard was quite upset. And one of the ways they decided to water it down was to move it from 2% by 2010 to a fixed target of, I think it was 9,500 gigawatt hours of electricity. And so what they basically did is they underestimated where they thought demand was going to be in 2010 and said, well, we'll make it a fixed target of that amount, knowing that electricity would grow more than that. Then in 2009, the Gillard government decided to expand the RET, and they introduced the new 41,000 gigawatt hour or 45,000 gigawatt hour target in 2009, and it actually passed with bipartisan support. Even the National Party didn't vote against it. Even Ron Boswell didn't vote against it, though he did grumble if you read the Hansard a bit about it. But part of the reason it had bipartisan support was it was so incredibly popular then, and it's still popular now. And so politicians didn't really feel, even if they were ideologically against the idea of market intervention, and they weren't particularly enamoured with the idea of renewable energy, they were still, it was so popular they didn't want to stand in its way. So renewable energy is very popular, but also the RET is very popular. So 71% in the same survey support the RET. 31% think the target should be higher, 37% think it's about right. So 68% think it should either stay the same or the RET target should be even higher. And only about 11% think it should be lower. Now, at the same time that it had bipartisan political support, the fossil fuel generators also supported the RET, largely supported the RET. Now, this might seem a bit odd now, but they supported it for a number of reasons. The first one was it was very popular. And again, it was a climate in which people wanted to take action on climate change. Renewable energy was very popular, so the generators didn't really want to stand in the way. But they also supported it because some of them were big producers of renewable energy. Some of the biggest producers of renewable energy in Australia also own coal-fired power stations. They also supported it because it was a fixed amount. Now, you might remember that Howard changed it to a fixed amount in order to try and dilute it. And essentially, the fossil fuel lobby got support from the Gillard government to make it a fixed target. And what they did was, again, is they conservatively estimated how much demand for electricity was going to grow. They thought it would grow more than this, and then they took 20% of that. So basically what they were hoping is the 20% target would actually be less than 20%. But ultimately they supported it because they thought that electricity demand was going to grow, and that, broadly speaking, renewable energy would take up that additional increase in demand, but that existing coal-fired generators and gas-fired generators wouldn't be affected. They would continue to produce their same amount, and just the growth would come out of renewable energy. And that's important because at that point they didn't believe that there would be any stranded assets, that they wouldn't be in any kind of problems, which, as it turned out, didn't occur. So how effective has the RET been since it was introduced in 2001? Well, from 2001 to 2012, according to the 2012 review of the RET, renewable energy capacity in Australia has almost doubled. In 2011, the RET produced 14,000 gigawatt hours, and from 2001 to 2011, it created 160 million certificates, which means it's 160,000 gigawatt hours of renewable energy. So it has been quite successful. And again, one of its problems is it was successful. Just as the original target was successful, this was a scheme that is actually succeeding. So how much abatement? So the point of the renewable target, its actual objective, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So how successful has it been at that? Well, since 2001, it's reduced emissions by 22.5 million tonnes. And it's expected to reduce emissions up to 2020 by an additional 76 million tonnes. So all up, we're looking at about 100 million tonnes of less emissions from 2001 to 2020. In fact, as I said, up till now, it's 22.5 million tonnes it's reduced emissions by. That's the most successful policy bar one, and the only policy for reducing emissions that's actually been better than the RET has been the carbon price. And it actually achieved it not from 2001 to 2012, but it achieved it in only 2 years. In 2 years, it's reduced emissions by 39 million tonnes, whereas the RET took about 10 years to reduce it by 22.5 million tonnes. But so the carbon price is probably the most efficient way of reducing emissions. Most economists will say that. But the RET is the second most successful policy at abating emissions. In fact, if the RET is left alone, that is, there's no changes before 2020, it'll actually go a sixth of the way to achieving the 5% emission reduction target all by itself. So that one policy will get us about 17% of the way to the target. And as the Abbott government is basically getting rid of pretty much all climate change policy and then introducing direct action, it seems odd that they might want to tamper with that, given that it's probably going to be the most effective. And most economists, including myself, don't think that direct action is going to be particularly effective. Now, the other side of the coin is that because the RET forces retailers to buy renewable energy certificates, that's a cost to them that they pass on to onto households or electricity consumers. So it has an effect on the price, and that's been the focus of some of the debate that's come out of the government. So what sort of price effect has the RET actually had? Well, the RET's increased retail prices by about 4%. It depends on who you talk to and what modelling has been done, but it's about 4%, and that works out at about $1.40 per week for the average household. So it's actually very, very little. It hasn't had a huge impact, particularly when you look at the amount of abatement that it's achieved, 22.5 million tonnes, for quite a small price impact. But at the same time as the RETs come in, there's been some other very big changes in electricity prices. Basically, over the last 6 years, they've doubled. Now, they haven't doubled because of the RET. As I said, the RET's only increased the price by about 4%. They've doubled mainly because of network costs, what's called the poles and wires. Basically, 55% of the price increase, more than half of it, has been because of network costs, increases in distributing electricity. Something like $40 billion has been spent over the last 5 years upgrading the network, and that's all been passed on to consumers. To put that in context, if we take an electricity bill from 6 years ago, it was roughly $1,000 for an average house, and now it's about $2,000. The amount that's being paid to network providers today is just over $1,000. So it's slightly more than the whole electricity bill 6 years ago, to give you an idea of how much it's actually increased electricity prices. It's the main game that's driving up electricity prices. Now, at the same time that electricity prices have doubled, we've had a lot of political sensitivity and a lot of upset from voters and the general public about this rise in electricity prices. In fact, it used to be petrol prices that were what politicians talked about when they wanted to sound like they were concerned about cost of living pressures. And then in about 2008, 2009, that switched to electricity prices, mainly because petrol prices stopped going up. They've been roughly flat for the last 5 or 6 years, whereas electricity prices have doubled. So effectively, if you want to be a politician and you want to sound like you're in touch with the electorate and you want to tell them that they're doing it tough and that they should get tax cuts and that really they don't have enough, then you talk about electricity prices and how horrible their increase is. Now, if you actually sit down and do some analysis, you find that people are actually better off. Certainly some people, particularly poorer people, are a lot worse off and are struggling with the increase in electricity prices. But NatSem did some modelling which showed that as people are far better off than they were 10 years ago, simply because wages have risen, taxes have come down, and so people's disposable income is a lot higher, even when you factor in all the costs of living. That is, even when you factor in petrol price rises, electricity price rises, and all the other stuff. People are a lot better off than they were 10 years ago. So this increase in high prices, also these high electricity prices, had another important impact that's impacted on the political scene, and that is they're part of the reason that demand for electricity has fallen. Now, you might think, well, the price goes up and demand goes down, big deal. But electricity prices, demand for electricity has actually been rising since World War II. It's got an uninterrupted growth for 50 or 60 years. So the fact that it suddenly stopped increasing is quite strange and completely unexpected. And one of the reasons is because prices have risen. But there is a number of things going on, and a guy called Hugh Sadler did a fantastic paper for the Australia Institute called Power Down, which looked at the factors that have led to the fall in demand. And apart from price, they include things like energy efficiency programs. So the government has mandated lots of different things around buildings, around appliances, and that's actually been quite a big, one of the largest decreases in electricity demand. We've seen slow growth in large industrial users. The high Australian dollar is probably the third best policy for abating emissions in Australia at the moment. Basically, the high Australian dollar has clobbered manufacturing. Manufacturing are big electricity users, and so they've basically decreased their electricity consumptions. There's also been there's been some major industrial closures, some aluminium smelters, some alumina plants, some oil refineries. These again are very large users of electricity, and these have basically decreased demand for electricity. And the final one is rooftop PV, which might seem a bit odd. That shouldn't decrease demand for electricity, but it's basically how we measure demand for electricity. The way we measure demand is basically how much energy we want from major electricity producers. And so an increase in PV basically happens behind the meter. So if a household puts PV, photovoltaic solar panels on their roof, they use that electricity rather than buying it off the grid, and that basically shows up as a decrease in demand in the stats. So rooftop PV is also a large reason why we've seen a decrease in electricity demand. So this slowing demand is incredibly important because it actually caused a shift in the attitude of the fossil fuel lobby to the renewable energy target. So in a situation where we have falling demand for electricity, and at the same time the renewable energy sector is increasing production, basically in that scenario, somebody has to lose out. That is, if the pie is getting smaller and the renewable energy slice of the pie is getting bigger, then somebody's pie is getting smaller, and that somebody has been coal-fired power stations. Effectively, since 2006, coal power has decreased its production by 25 terawatt hours of electricity, which is a sizable chunk of electricity, and it's actually led to the mothballing of some coal-fired power stations. Effectively, mothballing means they've turned them off. They haven't scrapped them. They can turn them back on, but they're not operating. They're not producing any electricity. So effectively, fossil fuel or coal power producers are being cut because of falling demand. They're also, on the one hand, and they're being cut by increases in renewable energy. So it's like they're being cut by two blades of the scissors. They're getting it from both directions. Now, power stations are expensive, and mothballing them is a big cost to fossil fuel users. So they're actually quite upset by that. They're facing stranded assets. Now, if you go back when they originally supported it, they didn't think that they would be facing stranded assets, and so this has been a big shock to them. Now, fossil fuel, coal-fired power stations are very quick to say, well, this is a government problem, but that's actually quite odd from an economic point of view. We have stranded assets all the time in an economy. Kodak had a lot of stranded assets. They were called photo development labs before digital cameras came along. Blockbuster Video had a lot of stranded assets. And nobody was saying, well, we need to bail out the DVD rental stores, or we need to bail out the photo development labs. And for exactly the same reason, there's no reason why the government should be bailing out coal-fired power stations. Effectively, people go into business in a market economy to make money. They make a return and they take a risk. And sometimes the return is quite good because they take a risk. And some of those risks don't pay off. And sometimes they get burnt. But that's a natural part of a market economy. And it's not a government's job to step in and bail out stranded assets, particularly when the bailing out of them is not in the public good. So it's not in Australia's best interest to bail out DVD stores or photo development labs, and it's certainly not in Australia's best interest to bail out coal-fired power stations. So the second important effect the renewables is having is that it's pushing down wholesale prices during peak demand. So we talked about prices. Retail prices have increased by about 4% because of the renewable energy target. So now I'm going to talk about wholesale prices, and they're different. So retail prices are the prices you and I face when we buy electricity. Wholesale prices are the prices that generators get for selling their electricity to retailers, who then sell it on to us. So wholesale prices are a part of the retail price, but they're not the whole part. So at peak times are very, very important to electricity generators, particularly the fossil fuel electricity generators. It's been estimated that electricity generators make about 25% of all their yearly profits from just 36 hours per year of generation. So in those 36 hours, the price goes way, way up. They sell a whole lot of electricity at huge prices because everybody wants it, and they make an enormous amount of profit. And they make very little profit at the other parts of the time compared to those peak times. And what the problem with renewable energy from the fossil fuel point of view is that it generates most strongly during those peak times. So in the afternoon on a really hot day, your solar panels are working really, really strongly and they're producing a lot of electricity. And this is the exact time when you see very large increases in electricity prices, or you used to see it. And even with the amount that the RETs produced so far, they've already started to see that wholesale prices have begun to drop, particularly at peak times. During the summer last year in South Australia, the energy market regulator released a paper showing that that wind power in South Australia moderated the peak prices. That is, that the wind generators were running hardest during those very hot times, and they basically cut the price. Now, this is incredibly problematic for fossil fuel generators. If they're producing a lot of their profit from a very short period of time, and basically renewable energy is coming in and cutting their profit, then they're losing out quite a bit. As I said earlier, the doubling of electricity prices over 6 years was primarily caused by network costs. Now, 55% was because of network costs. But the smallest increase of all the different categories was actually the generators, and it only increased by 5%. That is, over 6 years, wholesale prices have only increased by 5%, less than 1% a year. And the reason for that is because renewable energy has basically cut peak demand prices, which has had the effect of lowering wholesale prices all over. So it's basically put downward pressure on wholesale prices. To give you a comparison, the amount that goes to retailers in the electricity price over that same period increased by about 16%, so about 2.5% a year. And so basically in line with the CPI, which is 3 times as much as what the wholesalers' price increase was. And also we have evidence out of Germany that shows that after installing 25 gigawatts of solar PV, the profitable peak times have basically been gouged out. That is, a lot of solar PV has basically destroyed those peak generation times for the fossil fuel users. So it's not just in Australia that we're seeing this. Overseas, in countries that have got bigger penetrations of renewable energy, we're seeing exactly the same thing. So the fossil fuel lobby group has turned in the last few years from muted support for the RET to open hostility. Renewable energy represents not only a threat to their profitability, but for some it represents a threat to their survival. So some of these fossil fuel producers are going to have stranded assets, and it's distinctly possible that some of them will go broke. This is important because it represents, because their hostility represents, it comes about, because of their own self-interest, not because of the public good. So fossil fuel lobbyists will often say that they're concerned about electricity prices going up, which is kind of odd when they sell electricity. There's not a lot of firms that really are seriously concerned about their own prices going up, but they'll say that. But what's actually happening is their profitability is going down. And what was quite strange from my point of view was when Ian Macfarlane and Greg Hunt announced the latest review into the Renewable Energy Target. Hunt said that prices are going up, and Macfarlane said that we have excess generation capacity, which from an economist's point of view is really odd. Like, if you've got excess supply, why is the price going up? And essentially it's because it isn't really going up, or it is going up, but the only reason it's going up is because of network costs, not because of the issues that they're concerned about, like the Renewable Energy Target. Now, just today, some interesting modelling came out, which reinforces this idea that renewable energy puts downward pressure on wholesale energy prices. Basically, it was done by a mob called Rome Consulting. They're one of the big energy consulting firms, and the conclusion that it reached was actually the same as 2 other leading energy modelers, SKM, MMA, and Intelligent Energy Systems. So basically 3 of the big energy modelling companies have all came out and basically said the same thing, that renewable energy puts downward pressure on wholesale energy prices. Now, what was quite interesting about this modelling is it showed that if the RET was repealed, that is, if the government decided to get rid of the RET, electricity prices would actually fall for a year or two. But then they would rise and they would be $51 higher than they are now by 2020 for an average household. And that's basically because wholesale electricity prices would rise in the absence of a RET. Now, this is a bit odd, and some people have a bit of trouble getting their head around it, but it also sheds more light onto why fossil fuel lobbyists are so anti-renewable energy at this particular time. Now, to understand this fully, to understand the modelling fully, you just have to understand that new built coal and gas-fired power stations are more expensive than existing gas and coal power stations. And the reason is an accounting reason. That is, most power stations were built by governments who have possibly then sold them onto the private sector, and most of the capital cost has been written off. So essentially, old coal-fired power stations and gas stations, it's only the cost of fuel that is basically making up the cost of the electricity. The capital side and the maintenance of the power station, the capital side has kind of been written off. But if you build a brand new one, you can't do that. You've got to include the capital side. So at the moment, wholesale electricity prices are about $40 a megawatt hour, but if you had a new coal or gas-fired power station, they would require a wholesale price of about $80 per megawatt hour. And what this modelling basically says is if you get rid of the RET, then you have to build some more either gas or coal-fired power stations. And in order to do that, the wholesale price has got to double. Effectively, the RET is stopping that from happening at the moment, but if you get rid of the RET, the wholesale price needs to double. Now, if you own an existing power station and you're profitable at $40 a megawatt hour, and suddenly the price doubles to $80 a megawatt hour, you become exceptionally profitable, which is another incentive for fossil fuel generators to be against the RET. That is, not only is it cutting to their profit now, but if they got rid of it, they're likely to make a large windfall gain. And one of the reasons that it would be so expensive to build new coal is because the gas price is rising, but also the coal price has risen. I mean, on the back of the mining boom has been the increase in iron ore prices and the increase in coal prices. Now, that's good for our exporters and our miners, but it's not so good if you're a coal-fired power station. Effectively, the cost of buying coal has gone up. Now that we've got these factors, it's easier to understand the RET review and what it aims to achieve. The problem that the fossil fuel industry has is, as I said at the start, is that renewables are so popular. The general public really do like renewable energy and they still like the RET. So their solution has been to attack the effect on electricity prices. So people are very sensitive, as I said, about electricity prices. And so basically the political tactic is to link the RET with rising electricity prices. Even though it's only a tiny amount, we still need to link it. And this is why when Abbott announced that he was going to review the Renewable Energy Target, he said this. He said, "We've got to accept, though, that the changed circumstances of today, the Renewable Energy Target is causing pretty significant price pressures in the system." Pretty significant price pressures in the system is apparently $1.40 per week. And there was no mention at all that 55% of the price increase was because of poles and wires. Now, the fact that this political strategy of trying to link it to prices is actually quite effective. The CSIRO did some modelling a few years back where they asked people, were you in favour of renewable energy? And they got broadly similar results to what the Australia Institute survey got, that it was overwhelmingly supported. But then they asked them, well, if it caused electricity prices to increase, do you support it? And that's when support for it dropped. Okay, so now politicians are very canny about political popularity and what the public think, and they've obviously cottoned onto this. And so what they're going to try and do, and what you're going to see over this review of the RET, is every attempt made to link the renewable energy target to increases in electricity prices. Because if they know that they can cement that link in people's minds, then people will no longer support the RET and they'll be able to water it down. So now if we go on to the actual RET, the review. The review has been really, really quite odd. In the legislation, the RET is supposed to be reviewed every 2 years by the Climate Change Authority, which is an independent statutory body which doesn't have an alternative agenda. It's basically just set up to do a number of things, and one of it is to review the RET. Now, if you do have an alternative agenda, it's not a great choice to review the RET. And so effectively what the government first tried to do was they tried to get rid of the Climate Change Authority. When that failed, they then, because it got blocked in the Senate, they then decided, well, we'll just ignore the Climate Change Authority. So the Climate Change Authority is actually conducting a review of the RET as well, but the Abbott government just ignores that and has set up their own review. Now, what's been quite interesting is that the people they've chosen to run the review, the head of the review is a self-confessed climate change skeptic, and the rest of the review panel has strong links to fossil fuels and or an ideological preference for minimal government intervention. So having the climate skeptic as the head of the review is extremely strange, since the purpose of the RET is to reduce emissions. That is, the benefits, one of the main benefits we get from the RET is reduced emissions. So it would be a bit like conducting a review of public spending on hospitals and having the head of that review believe that people never got sick or injured. Pretty much there's no point to having hospitals if nobody gets sick or injured. So having somebody review it who thinks that nobody gets sick or injured is pretty pointless. And that's effectively what the government's done. The review will also do some economic modelling, which people like me get very excited about, but the vast majority of you don't really care, which is fair enough. But this modelling is actually quite interesting in the way in which they've done that as well. Firstly, it's been conducted by Acel Allen, who have strong links to fossil fuel interests, and also who's modelling the 2012 review of the RET, which was done by the Climate Change Authority. They actually rejected their modelling and said it was rubbish and didn't accept any of it. So they're the ones that are conducting the new review of the RET. The modelling will not include a number of things. It won't include any benefits that renewable energy brings to health, jobs, or any network benefits, that is increasing the cost of networks. And they basically said that they weren't going to do that because it was too hard. All right, so effectively, a lot of the benefits of the RET are not going to be modelled. So again, when you're trying to work out is the RET a good idea or a bad idea, that is the cost of the RET greater or smaller than the benefits, if you start cutting away all the benefits, pretty soon you're going to reach the conclusion that the costs are greater than the benefits. Another fascinating thing was the modelling will assume no carbon price or abatement target out to 2030. That is, there is going to be no carbon price or no abatement target in Australia out to 2030. So what does this mean? Well, it means that coal will stay profitable for longer. If we assume that in our modelling, we're basically saying that there'll be no additional price on coal, so coal will be more profitable, so that then shows that renewables will be relatively less profitable. But the idea that we're not going to do anything about climate change out to 2030, well, all I can say is I hope that's not the case, because there'll be big problems if it is. Another worrying sign is when the panel announced the modelling, the head of the panel, Dick Warburton, basically said that he didn't think that the renewable energy target of 41,000 gigawatt hours by 2020 was physically possible at the moment. He said the panel didn't actually believe that we could reach 41,000 gigawatt hours by 2020. Now, obviously, that's not true at all. The renewable energy target has been on track for quite some time now. There has been a slowdown recently in projects, but that's mainly because with the election of the new government, renewable energy producers or people who are thinking of constructing large-scale renewable energy things like wind farms and solar farms are a little worried that it's going to get watered down and they're going to be stuck with an asset that they can't make a profit on. But there's no indication from anybody, apart from Dick Warburton and his review panel, that it can't reach the target. So when you bring all that together, basically what we have is it seems to indicate that the review has been set up for a predetermined outcome. This shouldn't be a surprise. basically what we have is ideology teamed up with a well-funded lobby group and a government who wants to look like it's doing something about costs of living, and the result of that is bad for the RET. It's a program that's been too successful. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Matt. No tomatoes, no rotten fruit. We must be doing something right. The likeness is
The hair's
extraordinary.
not spiky enough, I don't
Would you not think? Now let me consult my how to host politics in the pub email. We need to ask questions. Don't let people ask more than one, and wrap them up if they start making statements. If you want to make a statement, you can make them to me at the bar later on, or express them through interpretive dance after the Q&A session. I've certainly got plenty of questions, but it's not really my turn. So, is there anyone out there who would like to kick it off? Madam.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Matt. That was brilliant. When you said about the modelling by, I think, Acel Adams with links to the fossil fuel industry, that it doesn't include the benefits to health and the networks, there was some other thing. What was it?
Jobs. So they're not considering any jobs created in the renewable energy sector as a benefit, because it's too hard to model, apparently.
Yep, thanks.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I did notice a ripple of excitement go through the crowd when Matt talked about economic modelling, and Acel Allen in particular.
As it always happens.
These are the same people who brought you modelling of a cash for cans scheme that assumed no one would ever claim the cash. And it's also the same people who Richard and I were in court against last year, who did some of the most extraordinary modelling of a coal mine that I've ever seen, and they suggested to a judge that we shouldn't worry about profits going overseas, that's actually pretty a good thing for the rest of us too. So, yeah, that's enough slander from me. Let's have some slander from you. We haven't won that one yet. We're still waiting for a judgment.
Hi. You mentioned that with increasing demand, if the RET was watered down, that coal-fired power stations would need to be built, which would be expensive, the capital cost. Do you not see that with increasing demand for renewable, like wind farms or solar farms? Do they not have large capital costs as well that would?
They do, but the cost of solar and wind is falling quite quickly, and they're in a kind of funny situation where the cost of a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station is the capital cost plus the fuel. Wind and solar don't have fuel costs, so they're actually they can actually become quite cheap, and as the capital costs go down, they're going to become cheaper. So at the moment, wind is about comparable with newly built coal or gas, but if we get rid of the RET, essentially we lose all the incentive to go to renewable, and effectively they have to build a new gas or coal-fired plant. But if you look at the cost per watt, say of solar, it's going down sort of exponentially like this, and if it continues on that path, or even if it slows somewhat, it'll still become cheaper over time.
I think we'll go with this gentleman in the blue, then this gentleman here, and then the fellow with the charming moustache at the bar.
While all this is going on, the population of Australia is increasing at about roughly 2% a year. So by 2020, it will be, roughly speaking, about 14% increase in population, and more than half of that is through people coming in on 457 visas. More than half of the 2%. And these are people in their prime who will be straight away into using energy. They won't be babies and they won't be ancients. They'll be straight away into using energy. I'm wondering how this is taken into account in your modelling.
I haven't actually done any modelling as such of the renewable energy target, but when they model what's going to happen into the future, they put in population growth. I mean, that's factored into how much what's going to happen in the future. So effectively, the modelling assumes that demand will slowly pick up. So it's expected to fall a bit, plateau for a while, and then increase. And it's essentially it's going to increase because population will grow slowly. So I mean, if in this period of time we increase renewable energy, then the impact that the rising population will have, particularly in their energy use, on greenhouse gas emissions will be a lot smaller.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you could say something more about the price of power, its impact on the poor. As I understand it, the causes of this world have been very concerned about increases in electricity prices. Now, in relation to the carbon tax, there's compensation, and I think you mentioned in relation to the RET, there will be, admittedly a small, but there will be a small component of increase cost, until a time when, in fact, the RET would serve to be a dampener on costs. But I mean, how does that translate politically in the attitude of the social welfare sector and its attitude to this review?
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. Basically, I think the best way to combat those kind of problems is through assistance from the state. So rather than linking it to electricity prices, that is having lower income households paying part of their electricity bill, but you're better off increasing welfare payments that they're getting. Why is that important? Because if you pay their electricity bill, they don't really have an incentive to try and reduce their electricity use. And admittedly, the poorer you are, the less ability you have to reduce that. The richer you are, the more you can do to reduce your energy usage. But I think that things like the New Start and disability pensions and these kind of welfare payments are woefully low in Australia. And the Australia Institute has long called for increases in that. And I think that's the best way to combat higher electricity prices for poor people, to actually target where the problem is, rather than trying to offset it by rebating their electricity, for example, or the cost of their electricity.
I've got a question in regards to the network costs, the poles and wires, so to speak. Why the big increase all of a sudden? Mm-hmm. Is it because of underinvestment or previously, or what's the big change there?
Sure, that's a very good question, and the answer is there's quite a lot of factors. Politicians like to give one and then blame it, and that's what they tend to do. So some people blame gold plating, some people blame the carbon price, but the reality is electricity assets last about 50 years. We last had a huge investment just after in the 50s. That's about 50 years ago. They all started wearing out at once. State governments have been very, very good at ignoring upgrading them because they were costly. And suddenly they started to wear down. At the same time, we had increases in reliability standards. That is, distributors were forced to guarantee electricity supply. So they had to upgrade from that. At the same time, we had an increase in the use or a decrease in the cost of air conditioning, particularly for homes, which increased peak demand, which meant that the networks needed to be upgraded. And at the same time, we had a regulatory framework which basically meant that any time a distributor invested money in capital works, they got a guaranteed rate of return. That is, they were guaranteed to get their investment back plus about 10%, as it worked out. There's a formula for figuring out, but it was basically 10%. So the more you invested, the bigger your profit was. And that's where gold plating came from. So they were very keen to do it. Some of it was probably necessary, not all of it, but there's a whole heap of factors that fed into that at the same time. And then right on the top of that, you have the carbon price and the RET and some other green, which are a tiny factor in the overall increase. But for political purposes, they've been blamed far more than the actual causes.
Got a gentleman in the second row.
Matt, you explained how the fossil fuel lobby has attacked the RET and is demonising it do you see any signs that they'll also turn their attention towards attacking energy efficiency for the same reasons, that it could reduce their revenue and increase their problem of stranded assets because appliances, etc., are becoming more efficient?
Possibly. It will depend on what happens to demand. So if the RET was watered down or abandoned by the government, that would initially give them quite a lot of capacity that they could rush into. And what we'll see is the opening up of the mothballed coal-fired power stations. Now, if demand continues to fall because of energy efficiency or for other reasons, certainly, then we'll start hearing about the cost of regulation and how regulation is awful and that the government should get out of regulation. And part of that regulation is making people buy efficient appliances and well-insulated homes, and that people should be free to buy crappy appliances and crappy homes. And you know, essentially that'll be the start of it, if you like, and that will lead into, well, we need to get rid of these nasty regulations.
And that already happens, by the way.
Yes, certainly, it already happens. There are some commentators out there, particularly on the far right, that complain about these things. But what you'll see is you'll see it come into the fossil fuel lobbyists and their friends will start to talk about this sort of thing.
Matt, in a system with a high degree of renewables feeding into it, what percentage of base load must you maintain to ensure that there aren't great power outages when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine?
That's a good question. The best answer is just to look overseas. So penetrations in places like the Netherlands and Germany, you have renewables up to 30% and they're still not encountering problems. So the honest answer is we don't know. The next answer is that technology changes all the time. Things like storage is dropping quite quickly. And so as storage becomes cheaper, if it gets to the point where you can actually start adding it to the network, then it'll matter less and less, because when the sun is shining, we'll just produce more electricity and we'll store it away. But that's not the case at the moment. But certainly we're at about 10%, and we want to be at 20% by 2020. And well, we're sort of about 12 or 13%, but we basically want to be at 20%. There are a number of other countries and electricity networks that are above 20%, they're up around 30%, and they still haven't encountered problems. So we certainly know that 20% is not a problem, and 30% is not a problem. Whether or not we can go to 40 or 50% without some form of new technology coming in, we still don't know yet.
Yeah, Matt, just a quick clarification. The Climate Change Authority isn't doing a RET review because they're expecting to be abolished in July, and the deadline is December. So if they're not abolished in July, they've got till December to do it, so they will do a quickie towards the end of the year if they have to, but they are expected to be abolished. My question is, the cost of abatement is quite high for the renewable energy target, so how do you address that criticism? And then a quick gratuitous comment. You're probably preaching to the converted here, so how do we get the message out to the Telegraph readers?
Sure. I think the Telegraph readers are lost. No, that's probably not true. I think I remember a survey that said that 60% of Telegraph readers thought that the Telegraph was an unreliable source of news. Maybe the comics and the sports are good, I don't know. But to get back to your first question, which was cost of abatement. You're right, the renewable energy target does have a reasonably high cost of abatement. It's not stratospheric. I mean, there's certainly far higher ones. There's a number of answers to that. The first is that a carbon price is the cheapest way of doing it. All right, it really is. If you want to reduce emissions, then the carbon price is the way to do it. In 2 years, as I said, it did more reductions than the RET did in 10 years, and the RET is incredibly successful compared to the next one. So it's light years of everything ahead of everything else. But the other thing is that in order for us to reduce our emissions by a serious amount, beyond a 5% reduction by 2020, which is fairly pathetic, we're actually going to have to change stationary energy, that is the electricity network. So what the RET does is it prepares the network, because a big behemoth like the electricity network with all its generators and all its infrastructure doesn't change particularly quickly. So there's an argument that says, well, if it has to change into the future, rather than waiting and taking all the abatement that's cheaper than that, let's introduce a policy that begins to change it now, which will have short-term costs, that is, abatement is more expensive in the short term, but in the long term we'll be better off. That is, we won't have to radically and quickly change something that will be very expensive to radically and quickly change. Oh, and as to preaching the converted, look, I mean, we're about to release a paper on the RET, but I think that the main thing about this entire debate, if you take away nothing else, it's that renewable energy is popular, and the only way they can make it unpopular is by linking it with electricity price rises. So getting the message out that renewable energy the RET has had minimal impact on electricity prices, and that in the long run it will actually reduce electricity prices, is the most important message that you can get out there.
First a comment. I mean, if you read what the grid operators have been saying in Germany, it's been far from trouble-free. They've come to crushing several times. And that illustrates a point, is that the operation of the grid, the way you do it and the way you regulate it, has to totally change.
Mm-hmm.
And what will happen, what will be needed to happen, make that happen?
So you're right that they have run into problems, but they've solved them, so they haven't had a crash. So at 30% there hasn't been a crash. That's not to say that it's easy or simple. It's just to say that with the current level of technological and knowledge that we can actually achieve that. What it'll require is it will require particularly the distribution side of the network to change. They will have to. At the moment, it's a real wheel and spoke. So there's a big power station in the middle, and we're all connected to it through wires. That has to change to when we have people who have got solar panels on their roofs, and we've got lots of different smaller wind farms and solar farms all over the place. Now, I've been involved with Transgrid, which is a transmission company, and they're actually trying to look at ways of changing. So there is a number of things that are happening sort of under the radar, if you like. They're aware that problems are coming. In Germany, for example, because when electricity prices have reached a certain level and PV and storage comes down, households are basically disconnecting from the network. And I asked one of the guys at Transgrid, are you concerned about that? And they said, well, yeah, we know it's going to happen because it's happened in Germany, was his response. Like, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. They know that is coming. And what they're trying to do is prepare the network for that when it comes. So they're certainly aware of the problem. What I suppose it needs is a bit of political leadership to push it. That is some regulation, or maybe not even regulation, but just basic. A lot of these networks are government owned. Having their owners push the idea that moving to decentralised power production is going to happen whether you like it or not. You might as well begin to prepare for it now and make the transition easier for yourself than to hold out and face a catastrophe at the end.
So I'm next. One of the other things that politicians respond to is popular opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And people may be interested to know that there is quite a campaign underway to protect the RET, and that's what it's called, Protect the RET. I would normally have had some petitions with me, but I managed to dispose of them at an earlier event today. But there is hard copy petitions available through Yes to Renewables. And if people are supporting renewables or have photovoltaics or wind generation on their property, can I strongly suggest that you join Solar Citizens, because we've just heard how organised the fossil fuel lobby is, and it's time for the small generators and people who support them to join together, and that's the basis for Solar Citizens, if you like. It's the renewables generators union, and I have, I think, one leaflet left, and I do have a sign-up sheet left here if people want to join up.
Sure, and just another thing to say, when petrol prices were rising, they were particularly problematic and a politically sensitive issue. When electricity prices were rising, when they stopped rising, they stopped being a particularly politically sensitive issue. When electricity prices were rising, they're a politically sensitive issue. But most of the infrastructure spending is probably done now. in that they've changed the regulations and the network's been pretty much upgraded. Electricity prices are unlikely to rise faster than CPI over the next 4, 5, 6 years. The RET's kind of in a dangerous zone at the moment where people are still concerned about electricity prices. In a couple of years' time, they're not going to be concerned about electricity prices. So if you can avoid its watering down now, it is unlikely to be tampered with in the future, if that makes sense. It's kind of in that sort of problematic danger zone at the moment where electricity prices are still an issue. They're not likely to be an issue in 2 years' time.
One last question before I consult my how to wind up the politics in a pub email.
Thanks. Just a question then about the interests of business, other business apart from the fossil fuel regulators. Why aren't we hearing more from them to try and defend some of these effective mechanisms that are in place, and where do their interests lie in the scheme of things?
Sure. So one of the big beneficiaries of solar that people don't necessarily know about are actually commercial buildings like offices, but also supermarkets and malls and things like that. And they're running into problems around what they want to do is set up large solar farms on their roofs and basically offset all of their electricity and make money on the fact that they've got a big roof area. But they're having trouble because there's a lot of resistance within the distribution network, and the way that it's currently regulated doesn't help them. And that's an example of where regulatory change in the distribution can actually help this along. But there is a renewable energy producers out there, commercial sort of size producers, and I know that you do hear about them, but I suppose I'd like to point them to the fact that for $21 million, the mining industry saved $100 billion when they told a sceptical Australian population that mining was the backbone of the country and you couldn't kill the goose that laid the golden egg. $21 million advertising campaign. There's no reason why large-scale renewable energy producers can't do the same thing.
Indeed. Well, thanks very much, Matt. I've been certainly energised by your presentation and by all the stimulating questions that we've enjoyed this evening. My last instructions from Richard and Serena to you all are to thank you for coming, so thank you very much. Please hang around and have a drink with us. It's always tough to get the TAI staff away from the bar, but if you can get past them, the bar staff will serve you too. All our talks do go up on YouTube, so if you can't wait to hear more about tonight, you can, in a week or so, you can probably go and watch it all again. Please visit our website, tai.org.au, and thanks very much for your support. If you like hearing progressive voices in public debate, continue to come along, and occasionally please give us some money. So thanks very much for coming. Thanks very much for Matt. A big hand for Matt. He's working very hard on these issues.